I would like to introduce the wonderful Christopher something.
Neugebauer.
Neugebauer.
Yay! Give Donna a hand. Not really anything that I have fixed conclusions on at the moment, but something that's been going through my head recently, not just during this conference, but more generally in the months beforehand, which is about platform bashing and whether or not it's affecting our ability as an open source community or open source communities to attract and retain contributors. And this was sort of spurred on by a piece that my friend Oren Shaw wrote called Contempt Culture a few months ago. And in this, she made quite a good observation that people who, PHP is a particularly widely derided language that has traditionally made it easy to write insecure programs and encourage bad programming practices. But large platforms like WordPress and Drupal have come out of that, and people are getting their first experiences of open source through platforms like contributing WordPress themes, which, whilst not being sort of systems level code, you're still writing substantial amounts of code to make WordPress themes work. And when people try to move beyond things like WordPress and into the broader open source community, these people are often derided for basically only having coded in PHP. And why would you ever code in PHP? It's such a terrible language. And I'm interested in discussing why or whether what sort of problems this is causing our community in terms of attracting and retaining long-term contributors who want to move on from basic contributions to open source to being lasting contributors, project leads and stuff like that. And this doesn't just extend to choices of open source languages, it extends to choices of platforms. Some people might be starting off on Windows and might be capable of making really good contributions on Windows, but are being scared off of this conference or this community by the fact that they're choosing to develop on Windows. And so we're not getting the degree of contributions for platforms that so many people are using. And I feel like this is probably harming our community quite a bit, and it's something that we should be talking about as a broader community. Whether or not we, as people who unashamedly enjoy using Linux, to a lesser extent Unix-like systems. I see Donna here is using a MacBook Air. I certainly am as well. How we should be, so I feel like we should be working towards encouraging our community to accept these as valid choices of technology and come to value contributions from these people. And this is a discussion that I'm not really seeing happening, but I feel that it's vital to making sure that our community is sustainable and healthy. And I'd love to start a discussion around this at some point. Well, we have time, but I've also added an inclusivity and welcoming topic to today, and I think this is something that's worth discussing there. Particularly, as Oren noted, a large number of people who are coding WordPress themes are women who we have difficulty attracting and retaining women as talent in the open source community. So I think it ties into this, but if you want to discuss this, I'm around this week and I want to talk about it.
Thanks, Chris. Jack, room monitor timekeeper, what is our minutes per lightning talk and allowable for question times? We have 9, I think. Okay, so keep the lightning talks to 5, less than 5. Just on that, Chris, I very much agree, and I helped write the code of conduct for the Open Source Developers Conference in 2010. And I just want to read a little bit of line. It's got the general, regardless of gender, etc., etc. preferred operating system, programming language, or text editor at OSDC. And I very much agree that the platform bashing stuff is really detrimental. Does anyone else want to kind of pick that up as a potential theme for this afternoon in terms of that inclusivity and welcoming? Does that fit? Some nodding there-ish. Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, next we have Stuart.
I guess I put up long-lasting organisational change, large organisation challenges, and non-violent communications. But I won't speak on non-violent communication because I'm nowhere near an expert or anything, but it's a good topic to discuss. The long-lasting organisational change point was something I've experienced a few times of when you're trying to affect change in something that already exists, because seldom are we starting something from scratch. We live in a world that already exists. We work in groups that already exist for the most part, and very seldom do we ever get to start something new and set the direction from the beginning. Usually we're modifying an existing system somewhat, or at least existing people. We can't spawn all the people we need to work on a project ourselves and wait for them to grow up. So I found that there are techniques for affecting large immediate change that then peter out and it reverts. So you can make a big impact for a month while you have all of the energy focused on that, and then suddenly people revert to old ways. Or there are other techniques where you start to generally more gradually and, for example, winning allies and making small incremental changes and constantly reporting progress and that kind of stuff, where you can help affect the change to last beyond your lifetime of huge amounts of effort, and so that you actually fundamentally change the organisation for better. And that can generally be a bit slower and a bit more irritating, but I found, at least for when exercising some of these things, that I've managed to affect change that has existed long after I've left an organisation and a group and seen sort of a positive change go forward and people take over that role. And so I wanted to have that as a discussion where it's like, this is not a sprint. This is a marathon of changing the world, and therefore how do we change the world over a long period of time, not how do we change it this week, because that's irrelevant. Anyone can do something for a week. The other thing with large organizational challenges sort of blends in a bit of this, of then large organizations generally have a lot more people, which means there's a lot more avenues of communication. There's a lot more existing systems that may be very interesting to deal with, as well as you've got a large opportunity for making a lot of change and a big impact on the world. But at the same time, you're steering a very large ship that probably several other people are also trying to steer in different directions. And then how do you perhaps deal with this, especially when you're now trying to create maybe a community outside that and you are indeed the giant elephant in the room at the same time, as well as having existing large groups where it's like, oh yes, we're now going to do that. You've convinced me that's a good idea. We now have this 100 people joining your group of 4, and how you deal with that when suddenly you have a big influx due to not so much a ground up of attracting people, but being assigned them, and how you deal with that. The other thing, interesting, nonviolent communication is sort of a way to really achieve those things of, instead of going, you're wrong, you're an idiot, and I hate you, to be a way to say, I disagree with your idea and this is why I think we could do it this way and it may be better. How do we make a constructive thing to actually affect change and not just express your frustration, as well as possible a sub thing of that of at what point do you go out and yell at clouds for a while to sort of get that frustration out. But yeah, that's sort of where I'm coming from for those topics.
Thanks, Stu. Does anyone want to follow it up with any questions or comments on that? Nope. Okie dokie. Cara. Do you want to project?
No, it's just some notes. Yeah, I guess I'm sort of talking about codes of conduct. It's sort of, hard to know how to make this point clear, but I've been having a bit of this sort of uneasy feeling about code of conducts ever since there was that controversy about, I think a bunch of companies quite early last year came out with this fairly toothless code of conduct. They were what was it? Yeah, the To-Do group. And I mean, that kind of petered out, but it kind of made me have some thoughts about the kind of relationship between the community governance process and the way corporates who rely on sort of their community relationship deal with codes of conduct, especially toward, you know, their own employees or workers. So obviously, like, I don't want to have a go at anyone in a corporate context who is trying to push like better governance and better community management with the responsibilities they do have. But I think there's sort of some tension that we have to be aware of where, like, if there's a corporate that has, you know, manages a community, they don't actually want the inherent conflict that's driven, you know, needing a code of conduct. They don't necessarily want that to be completely visible. Whereas actually, I think for the community, if we're going to have the sort of process of reform and developing a better culture, you actually want that to be done quite publicly and democratically, not like responding to specific incidents of discipline that the code of conduct needs, but sort of the general process of adopting it and making it part of the community, I actually think needs to be done in the open, and the conflict needs to be seen by everyone and resolved. And I don't think, for example, like Twitter or Facebook would actually want the projects they manage to be seen to kind of have this conflict. And so I think we have to be aware of like what that means for us in the community. And yeah, like I think also if you're writing, you know, when people have written a code of conduct, it sort of has at its core, there's this inherent thing where like anyone who's in the community is basically a volunteer. You know, all the participation is voluntarist. So like you have to take that into account with the kind of mechanisms you can use to discipline people, with the kind of reform you can carry out. But that's just not the case at all in terms of like someone being paid to do something. So the whole way we think of like how a code of conduct can affect change, what it means for the community, I think it's really strange then to take that and apply it to something that, you know, a company is using to manage a community, at least partly. And I think we have to say that actually they have more of a responsibility to be, you know, much more sharper in how they respond to those things, especially if it's, you know, someone being paid to do it. But at the same time, you know, I think it's quite fair for the community to exclude someone on the basis of their, you know, their dodgy behaviour, of their views, if we don't agree with it. But is it fair for a worker to be fired on the basis of that? I think there's some complexity there. Yeah, I guess those are really my thoughts. It's just a general unease about this, because it's quite, in a good way, we've made it quite trendy to talk about codes of conduct. And I think a lot of people in the private sector have seen that, and it comes from a good place. But I think we have to be quite critical of the way that a model that's for managing a voluntarist community where everyone is sort of in it together, quite critical of the way that could be sort of opportunistically taken on by corporates who actually should be able to do a lot more, or who could use that in a way that is not really to the benefit of the community. Yeah.
A quick apology to Cara, Chris, and whoever else spoke. I already blurred. Stuart, thank you, Stuart. I was going to call out the fact that we're recording the lightning talks, but we don't have to. Is it okay? Stuart, is it okay? Chris? Okay. Anyone? You can't open your mouth without saying something controversial. But for any of you else who are going to get up and give a quick lightning talk, if you don't want it recorded, then that is absolutely fine. We will turn off the recorder, okay? So just calling that out. Thank you so much so far. I think we had someone come in, so a quick welcome. And do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Hi, sorry for being late. I'm Martin. I'm a Debian developer and very interested in stuff that you're doing.
Thanks, Martin, and welcome. Okay, next up we have Jono.
So the topic that I suggested earlier on was about reputation and how we define reputation. And I guess this is a question which I'd like to open up to the floor for consideration. I think one of the core premises of what makes open source so tremendous is the fact that it opens up a door in which people from a variety of different backgrounds can do really great work in a context that doesn't traditionally judge them by or shouldn't judge them by the color of their skin, their gender, what car they drive, what haircut they've got, whatever, all that kind of stuff. And consequently, we always talk about things like meritocracy, and we talk about, you know, great people who do great work in projects. But fundamentally, the way in which we determine that work today, I think, is a human thing. Like it's based upon judgment and perception. And I'll give you an example. When I was at Canonical, helping to build the Ubuntu community, there was one time when I asked a member of my team to basically pull all the data from who was doing software development or who was doing packaging work for Ubuntu, and kind of list who had contributed the most to the project. Like this was a very kind of mechanical way of determining who was active. And there was about 400, 500 people on that list. So we brought that down to the top 100, and about 50% of those people I'd never heard of. And I was in a fairly senior position in the Ubuntu community. I spent my entire day around Ubuntu, and I didn't know who most of those people were. So these are people who are doing really good work, but they're not being recognized by the leadership in the project. So this got me thinking that I wonder how we can effectively determine reputation in a systematic way in our projects. Now, there are some things to think about here. So there are various implementations of reputation or trust, like Discourse. The forum has got a great model in there around trust that's basically defined by, if you pass this arbitrary set of tests, then you go up the trust levels. You've then got things like Stack Exchange and Stack Overflow, which has got ways in which you get points attached to actions. And the challenge with that is that it can be gamed quite easily. You've got things like Launchpad, where you have an aggregate karma score. But the karma is weighted towards certain things, such as when I was there, it was weighted towards creating blueprints as opposed to fixing bugs. So as a manager, I had loads of karma, even though I wasn't fixing any bugs. So what I'd like to open up is to think about is, if you were to write a piece of software that effectively determines what good is within the context of a project, what would we think about in that, and what would that look like? And I'm not talking about the technical implementation about that. What I'm more interested in is, how do we define great contributions? And great contributions in a way that somebody can join a project and they can rise the ranks and do great work. And if they're not a self-promoter, if they're not a naturally confident person, that their work will speak for itself. And it's been something I've been kind of mentally crunching for the last 3 or 4 months. That I think together we could come up with some really interesting ideas. So, thank you.
Thank.
There's one thing within community and developer community there, and there's another within a corporate one. So when you're in a corporate environment, how do you actually say a management chain of these people are silent, they're doing really good work, and I like them? Because everyone in that development community knows that person's doing great work at some point. But then how do you make sure that, you know, an SVP suddenly goes, meets this person, goes, I've heard good things about you? Yeah. I think that's another challenge.
Yeah, so have you heard of Katie McLaughlin's Octo Hat Rack project? No. So it's she wrote a tool for basically pulling all the data off the GitHub API, showing what contributions that weren't tracked by the funny green graph that shows up on people's GitHub profile is, and shows them for individual users, showing where they've contributed but they're not recognized. So,
showing individual contributors, you know, where they're not recognized by the GitHub graph, or contributors to projects who don't really show up as code contributions but show up as pull request commenters and stuff like that. She's running the functional programming mini-conf at the moment, but you should probably have a talk to her during the lunch break or something like that.
Thanks, Chris. Any other comments or questions for Jono on that one? Thanks, Jono. Oh, yep. Also, someone new came in, so please introduce yourself as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Atwood, and I'm the director of the open source programs, one of the directors of the open source programs office at Hewlett-Packard, and been at HP. Been at HP for a while, and at LCA for many years. Thank you. Less of a question than a concern. I've been noodling over what are good ways to measure contribution metrics for years, and I am fearful, and I would like to be made unfearful, but I am constantly fearful as we come up with good metrics. Every one of them can be gamed, not even out of malice, but you get more of what you reward, and every possible metric that we can measure is doubly or triply indirect away from actually doing good work. It gets even more risky when you're in a corporate setting where people are, people will gamify with absolutely no sense of morality or shame whatsoever to make their quarterly bonus. So I would like to not be fearful, but I don't think it can be done on this.
I'm keen to discuss that because I think you actually can make it so it can't be gamed. The key thing is that the metrics are A, not shared, and B, adjust and adapt over time for different methods of contribution. So we're looking forward to talking about that. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jono. And I'd like to be a fly on the wall in that conversation. So, sorry.
I just sent a tweet out and tagged it with the tag here. We covered it on opensource.com. We wrote an article.
Oh, awesome, Ricky. Thank you. Okay. Timekeeper? Sweet. So you're doing a 2 and a 1. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Jono. Very big topic there and very one I'm also keen on. You must my facilitator stars on that one as well. Who's next is the other Chris. Speaking of my facilitator stars.
Kia ora nō tātou. So my one is not fully formed or even slightly formed, but I just know that I work in an organisation of 230 odd people. There are 3 Māori in that organisation. If I think about Wellington, New Zealand, where I am, population about 500,000. If you're Greater Wellington, there are about 5 of us Māori working in IT and I know all of them. You know, it's a really small pool, and so and I feel like that is not atypical. That is quite typical of IT and even to a further extent open source around the world. So I work on a project that deals with libraries. Libraries deal often with trying to balance inequalities and so Indigenous populations are massively overrepresented in poverty and shorter life expectancy and all those kind of things, and massively underrepresented in most of the fields that could alleviate some of those issues. So I think my one kind of dovetails into the inclusivity, into the welcoming newcomers. I'm pretty sure, like I'm probably one of the palest Māoris you ever meet. I present as pretty much Pākehā as you can get. That's we had Norwegian whalers marry into the family in the 1835s. But I'm fairly sure that I am the only Māori at LCA, and I'm fairly sure I've been the only Māori at LCA at every LCA I've been to, even the ones in New Zealand. And I think we're missing a massive group of people, and I'm kind of talking about this in my talk on Thursday, that Indigenous communities have been managing communities for a long, long time. They have techniques, they're perhaps closer to the community, the group management model than the individualism of a Western society anyway. So I think there's techniques that we could learn, there's ways that conflict are dealt with, there are long-running ways of handling grievances and stuff that we could learn from, and we're missing out on those people because for whatever reason, they're not feeling like it's a place they should be. So that's it.
Thanks so much, Chris. And I actually want a disclaimer here as to why I want to put my facilitator stars on this. I was very, I actually tried to, I encouraged wanted there to be 3 mini-confs at this event. This one, obviously, but that was a set and forget. We did it last year and it's not that hard. The bioinformatics mini-conf that happened yesterday, that was great, and I really encouraged Alan to do that. And the one that didn't get up, which is an Indigenous mini-conf, where I approached Luke Pearson, the guy who runs the Indigenous X curated Twitter stream. If you're not following that, then I really strongly suggest that you do. So he has a different Indigenous person, an Australian Indigenous person, curate that each week. There's also now an Indigenous X Canada, where he's doing that. I don't know if there's one. But I also reached out to Digital Maori. So I wanted Luke and Digital Maori to combine forces and run an Indigenous mini-conf. Because just like we had the Hexen and the Linux Women mini-conf for years, that really changed the script for Linux Australia and this community, that we actually started to make this a welcoming place that women came to. I was kind of hopeful and naive that doing something similar to encourage talking about the technology in Indigenous communities around the world would really make a huge difference and start to change that. Because I don't know about any of you, but I'm quite involved in the community, but I don't think I know a single Koori, Murri, Aranata, Wathaurong person in our community. I don't know of anyone who's willing to, identify in a loud, proud kind of fashion anyway. So I think it's really important, and when we talk about diversity, that we're losing. In Australia, we're committing linguicide in a way that the way we've lost animals is nothing compared with what we've done to lost languages. And when you lose a language, you use a whole knowledge system. That's why I'm passionate, and that's why I'm putting my stars on Chris's topic here, because I think it's really important. Anyway, I should not abuse my pulpit. Thanks, Chris. Very much appreciate it. Ricky.
Okay, I wrote notes because I'm better in print than I am speaking, so I didn't want to forget. But I'm going to talk about behind-the-scenes support, and I'm not going to mention, I'm going to use a couple of specific examples, but I don't want to mention the projects or the people because the examples could be many projects or people. But I was at an event last year, and I was friends with a keynoter, and she'd been invited to speak by the group. It was a well-known older open source project, and they're having a severe diversity issue, and they're having a hard time getting new people in the project, and then they're scaring off, some individuals in the project are scaring off longtime contributors because they were unfriendly and hostile and whatever. So they invited my friend to give a talk, and it was a really great talk, and it was about how to communicate more civilly in mailing lists and emails and whatever, which you would think we wouldn't have to have this conversation if you're a bunch of adults on how to not be a jackass an email or mailing list, but apparently you need a keynote on that because it's still a problem. And after the keynote, I saw her later, and it was like, that was a great talk. It seemed like it was well received. And she's like, yeah, I've had several people come up really angry about it, and they don't think they should have to speak civilly, and their rights are being violated and whatever. And I was like, wow, that sucks, And so we're in line for the little snack, break time, and only 2 women in line, and there's at least a dozen men behind us, and they'd all been in the keynote. And a guy comes up and starts, he's like, can I ask you a question? Which is always a red flag, because it wasn't a question at all. It was a tirade on how he shouldn't have to speak civilly in email and mailing lists, and he should be able to, call people names if they're stupid and whatever. And nobody did anything, and he was getting more and more animated, more aggressive. And finally I said, ignore him, he's trolling you in the snack line, And afterwards, I talked to the organizers, and I said, this is what's disturbing, is all these people were in, the talk today, and they're all thinking, oh yeah, that's awful that people do this, but none of them spoke up and, said anything to this guy. The only person who came to her defense was another woman in line. So this was last spring, and a couple months ago, another thing happened, and someone who is on a project that I'm loosely connected to, which I had no idea, I'd never even heard of this project, but he was kind of being trolly on some forums and making fun of codes of conduct, and posted an anti-code of conduct, and so a couple people reached out to me, a couple women reached out to me in private and said, do you know anything about this, and what's the policy, does your organization have any kind of system for this or whatever? And I was like, I don't know, I'll look into it, I have no idea what's going on. And so I sent a note on a private mailing list that had quite a few people on it and said, does anybody know what's up? This is disturbing because somehow it looks like I'm connected to this project that has behavior that I think is really inappropriate, and not the kind of thing I want to be connected to. And very few people said anything, on the mailing list in response, but I got several men, who sent me notes in private, that was great, thank you for doing that, thanks for speaking up, I totally support it, but I don't want to speak publicly, I don't want to get involved, I don't want to get trolled, and I wrote back to every one of them, thank you, your private support means a little to me, but your public support would mean a whole lot more, and we're not going to see a needle move until you are speaking it publicly and saying, no, we want to work with nice people too who are civil, and it's not just about women, we want to work with people who are friendly, and this is not an unreasonable thing to expect that we will all speak politely and professionally in mailing lists or in person. So anyway, it's just something to keep in mind that while private support is lovely to have, it's not really effective in forcing change, and that's something I would like to see more people who are in positions of actually making a difference speaking up. When you're only 2 women in a group of, however many men, it's much harder. I mean, we're setting ourselves up there for much more trolling than these men who are showing me, private support. So on this topic of behind the scenes, though, the other thing I tell, people who have never witnessed any kind of harassment or, inappropriate behavior at events, or they haven't, felt it themselves. As bad as you might think it is, I'm behind the scenes. I've been in this for a long time, and a lot of people confide in me, and I would guess at least 75% of incidents don't get reported because I know I haven't reported things that have happened because I don't want that to be the thing that happened. I'm at an event to do other things. I don't want, when a thing happens, you just want out of it. You just want to do your job. You don't want the repercussions and the fallout that come. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and maybe more of us might need to report things, but more importantly, more people need to be showing support in front of the scenes. Thank you.
Awesome, Ricky, thank you. 2 comments on that. One, in the Drupal community, I've been working on code of conduct stuff there. And one of the things we've been trying to talk about is empowering bystanders, that we all must uphold the code of conduct so that you don't have people standing around watching it happen, that anyone can feel that they can say, hey, this isn't cool. So that was one. And the other one is the sense of this unreported tidal wave of stuff happening. The broken stair metaphor, definitely happening. And I had a conversation with Chris at OSDC about that really having a code of conduct is step 0, and it's really past time to be talking about that, where we need to have our step 1 is that we have an effective means of reporting that people feel is safe and understands how to do it and what happens when you do. And then really what's important is that step 2, which is what happens with that report and what's the effective response. And I'm really excited to see just today a tweet from I think Audrey Eschright doing safety PDX, something Portland-based, about this code of conduct enforcement and methods of dealing with reports. So on the money, Ricky, thank you. Awesome. So how are we going for time? Cool. Sheree? Yeah.
What I think is really important... Thanks. What I think is really, really important also, as you said, is not wanting it to be the thing that defines your experience of an event. And so I think that's really, really important as a part of the process of being able to have a situation dealt with quickly, effectively, in a way that everyone's happy, and then you can just move on. That's really important too.
Here, Sheree, thank you. Anyone else want to respond to that one? Okay. Yeah, I think with code of conduct and those that's got to come back on the table this afternoon. Quentin.
So Brisbane got a call out yesterday about the number of LA sponsored events that were happening. I think there were 3 on the screen. I think there was actually closer to 5 last year. And it just sort of got me thinking that the groups that I'm specifically involved in, they're technical, free, open source software groups. There are very similar groups around Brisbane, the WordPress conference, the Joomla conference, that almost passed me by. I only found out about them by happenstance and put my hand up to help volunteer at their conferences and stuff. I also put my hand up to try and keep the Linux Australia calendar up to date so that the whole community actually knows what other bits of the community are doing. And that's a very difficult thing for some reason. So there's the free open source stuff that I'm keen on. There's the broader sort of open
source community around that. And a little bit further than that, in terms of a Venn diagram, there's the sharing and learning groups that want to share information and share teaching. So I do a lot of stuff with libraries. I do stuff with ResBaz that's happening this week, and the Software Carpentry group. So I just wanted to comment that we have very poor communications with groups that share a lot of very similar values, and we should try and fix that. You never know the size of the group that you're actually in. So we all here care about sharing information and teaching people how to do new things. And those groups are enormous, and we will never know all of the members of those groups. And what I've tried to do in Brisbane, at least, is volunteer at as many of these different groups as possible, and to become at least known between these groups so that they can ask me questions when they have particular needs. So we have spent a lot of time doing AV stuff in Brisbane. There are a lot of different groups who would like to do recordings of things, and I can see Joel sort of shirking away from that. But there's a lot of skills that are non-technical skills that all of our groups can share between different groups. So I really just wanted to say that our group is tiny compared to the overall size of the group that is interested in sharing knowledge and information.
Thank you. Any comments and questions on that one? Yes, Jack.
Sydney, both between smaller communities around PHP, Joomla, WordPress, etc., but wider between different languages, and it's really started to become quite strong in the last 12 months.
That it's improving, or the distance is getting more?
More people involved, and more people between different communities.
Building bridges.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other? Then we have Molly.
Some people wanted to talk about codes of conduct, so I just wanted to say a few things about them. And this is really just because I read the Geek Feminism wiki page on it, because we're writing a code of conduct for our project. Things that are really good in them is to address very specific things, giving examples of stuff that's acceptable and unacceptable, especially in gray areas. One of the problems with doing this is that's when people will pick it apart and say, well, what if I did this specific thing? That's why you always have to kind of have a clause of and we're going to deal with things on a case-by-case basis. Another really important thing is to make sure you have easy reporting strategies. I think Kara made a really interesting point about dealing with things in closed environments versus open environments, and that's a really good case of a corporate interest versus a community interest. Something that a lot of people have trouble with when they're dealing with code of conduct violations is if they feel safe reporting them, right? So in order to do that in an open community way, you have to have a community that has spaces for people to be vulnerable or offended, and not be afraid of repercussions. But if you're doing it in a closed community, you also need to have people be reassured that their concerns are going to be addressed and that the people involved also have a willingness to provide safe spaces. So codes of conduct are super important. If you're doing them, make sure that they're specific and make sure that people know what kind of actions they can take. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, the Geek Feminism, anti-harassment and code of conduct stuff is a mine of fabulous resources, definitely. And then we have a question mark. Jack, did you want to? Yeah. And also, I just want to. I think we've still got some time. Martin and Mark, if either of you would like to get up and do a lightning talk on a topic of relevance, then I think we have time if you so desire. But first, Jack.
Thank you.
I need to get someone else to time him.
I've got a timer up in front of me. And notes. A little bit. I might get distracted as well. I'm multitasking. I kind of want to share a bit of a story and a growth of the community. So I am a PHP dev by background and interest. I've been doing it for about 8 to 10 years now. A couple of years ago, about 2013, I got involved in attending a local user group, and I think that's the first toe in the water moment for a lot of people is after work or lunchtimes, going out and actually meeting other people face to face. Now at the time, the community was 5 people, maybe 15 on the larger meetups. Small lecture theatre, I want to say about half the size of this room. And it was very much a blokes club, and a room full of neckbeards, so to speak. At the end of that year, 2014, the organiser at the time got a bit busy, pretty hectic. We ended up working together. And it was an opportunity for me to go, well, we've already got the venue. I can do a talk. You're busy. Let me help out. And this is where I got more involved in the community and ended up mostly organising a user group for 2014. I got really excited at that point. I could see so much more that I could learn from other people by being involved in that. And over time, and there are a number of people involved, we've grown the group quite large. The other thing that we got more involved in 2014 was cross-community events. So Christmas parties where we'd get together frameworks and languages and try and socialise and network. And this is where the issue of drinking culture really started to come into play. Sponsored events where companies would give cash for networking were somewhat tainted by behaviour that is commonly excused through alcoholism. And so 2015 was a year we actually took the meetup away from a pub. And we noticed that the pub had people sitting around and not necessarily facing a speaker. Going to a pub means people rock up early. We would have attendees that were drunk before talks would begin. So moving it away into an office area, dedicated seating facing a speaker, set the expectation for an audience, set the expectation for behaviour. And in a year of doing that, we went from about maybe 15 to 30 people at a pub to full RSVPs, 100, 120 people in a room. Last year, I can say we were really excited to have 30 to 40% new attendees in a room, which we hadn't seen before. And our Lightning Talks nights, we had at least 30% non-male speakers, which I was really, really quite thrilled at. And so seeing a change in the drinking culture, I think has had a huge impact on our ability to be welcoming to new people. Last year, we held the first Meetup Mix-Up, which was a cross-technology event with the expectation of there will be alcohol, but it is not a drinking event. We catered food as a priority, non-alcoholic beverages as a priority. We had arcades, we had bowling. It was a fun social night. And the feedback from attendees was fun. It was engaging. It wasn't bad experiences. We did not have a single incident reported to any of the 4 organisers. And I think that that's a huge, huge achievement for a community of probably 500 to 600 reach at that point with about 100 attendees. And so, yeah, I just want to share that experience and learning from what was traditionally a closed 5 to 10 people, all males in a room, to a community that is now much more open and accepting of new members.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack. Are we meant to wrap up at 12:20? Yes. Okay, so we've only got a few minutes left, so sorry, Martin and Mark. I led you astray. Or you give it a quick word? Come on. You've only got a minute.
All right. Well, we talked about this yesterday. It sent me off stage if you've already mentioned it, but I feel like the code of conduct that we have here at this conference and also at other conferences is sort of like step 0. Coming at this from like raising children, we did, okay. Well, in that case, I won't say anything.
Thanks, Martin. Mark, did you want to? No, very serene. Stuart, you've said a lot. You know that monitor role? We have to keep an eye on the people who say a lot.
I just wanted to possibly add a topic on the idea of burnout and picking your battles, on the idea is that you can't, if I listed all the large-scale change I want in the world and decided to pick all of those battles, I would achieve exactly nothing but killing myself. Yet, I get very, very selective about what I put effort in on the idea that I actually want to achieve something. And I think, the problem here, I'm like, well, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Oh, I want to do that. I want to do that. I want to do that. It's like, no, reality takes over. And I think we have a problem where people will spend all of their life doing it and relax at some point.
Very much so. We did do a good session on burnout last year, so it might be something to pull up the notes this afternoon. Now, look, I'm conscious that we're kind of getting close to lunchtime. What I'm really tempted to do is steal some time from this afternoon to figure out where we want to focus this afternoon, rather than trying to do it in a rush now before lunch. I think if we come back with full bellies and happy hearts, that will be in a good space. But just hugely wonderful. Let's have a collective round of applause for people who got up and did the lightning talks. And a collective round of applause for all of you for being here, because these are big topics and it's really wonderful to be able to, explore them in this way. So another round of applause. Thank you.